A letter to 5 of the presidents who owned slaves while they were in office. George Washington, when you won the revolution, how many of your soldiers did you send from the battlefield to the cotton field? How many had to trade in their rifles for plows? Can you blame the slaves who ran away to fight for the British because at least the redcoats were honest about their oppression? Thomas Jefferson, when you told Sally Hemings that you would free her children if she remained your mistress, did you think there was honor in your ultimatum? Did you think we wouldn't be able to recognize the assault in your signatures raping your slave when you disguise it as bribery, make it less of a crime? When you wrote the Declaration of Independence, did you ever intend for black people to have freedom over their bodies? James Madison. When you wrote to Congress that black people should count as 3/5 of a person, how long did you have to look at your slaves to figure out the math? Was it easy to chop them up? Did you think they'd be happy being more than just half human? James Monroe. When you proposed sending slaves back to Africa, did black bodies feel like rented tools? When you branded them, did the scar on their chests include an expiration date? When you named the country Liberia, were you trying to be ironic? Does this really count as liberation? Andrew Jackson, was the Trail of Tears not enough for you? Was killing Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminoles not enough to quench your imperialism? How many brown bodies do you have to bulldoze before you can call it progress, Mr. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson? When you put your hand on the Bible and swore to protect this country, let's be honest in who you were talking about. When the first Independence Day fireworks set the sky aflame, don't forget where we were watching from. So when you remember Jefferson's genius, don't forget the slaves who built the bookshelves in his library. When you remember Jackson's victories in war, don't forget what he was fighting to preserve. When you sing that this country was founded on freedom, don't forget the duet of shackles dragging against the ground my entire life. I've been taught how perfect this country was, but no one ever told me about the pages torn out of my textbooks, how black and brown bodies have been bludgeoned for 3 centuries and find no place in the curriculum. Oppression doesn't disappear just because you decided not to teach us that chapter. If you only hear one side of the story, at some point you have to question who the writer is. So the title of that poem is History Reconsidered. I taught high school English for several years in Prince George's County, Maryland, and part of what I always think about is how important it is to complicate history and how important it is to push back against so many of the dominant narratives we hear about the presidents and the founding fathers and all of the people we sort of raise up as false idols, and we raise up as these sort of paragons of freedom who were flawless individuals. And we don't wrestle with the complexities of their humanity. We don't wrestle with the fact that many of these were brilliant men, but they were also men with deep prejudices against people of color, against indigenous people, against women. And I think it's important for us to hold both of those things up at the same time. Like, we both have to recognize that Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a brilliant man, and we can also and must also hold up the fact that he was deeply racist. And so, for example, in Thomas Jefferson's memoir, Notes on the State of Virginia, which is this sort of manifesto of sorts, he writes that black people are inherently inferior to white people in endowments of body and mind, and that the slave essentially is incapable of love, and the slave is incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. And so I think about that, and I think about how that was the Jefferson that I was never taught about in school, how the Jefferson I learned about was the intellectual founding father of this country, responsible for the conception of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And we never talked about the fact that he owned slaves. We never talked about the things he wrote about Phillis Wheatley, who was the first published African-American poet. And he writes in his Notes on the State of Virginia, he says that, like, essentially, black people do not possess the intellectual or artistic acumen with which to create beautiful things like art. So black people can't be poets. So we shouldn't call Phillis Wheatley a poet because she doesn't possess, as a black woman, the skill or the wherewithal or the sort of emotional disposition with which to create art. And I think that it's really important that we wrestle with those things. And I think Jefferson is a microcosm of so much of history that we try to erase. Brian Stevenson, someone who I really admire, always talks about how we have such an ahistorical sense of how the movements for racial equality have manifested themselves. And he always says that we talk about the civil rights movement like it was this 3-day festival. And on day 1, Rosa Parks sat down on the bus. On day 2, Martin had a dream. And on day 3, we had the Voting Rights Act and everybody saying kumbaya. And we don't remember that this was a 10-year plus struggle. We don't remember all of the ways in which people actually, when Martin Luther King died in 1968, most white people didn't like Martin Luther King. Most people despised him. Most people, if you go back and look at all the public opinion polls, very much disagreed with how he was going about. And so if you don't understand, if you think that, you know, Martin Luther King is this person who everybody agreed with at the time that he was doing the things, it allows you to look at somebody like Colin Kaepernick and say, oh, well, Martin Luther King wouldn't agree with you. He would have done it differently, because you don't understand actually that most people didn't agree with what he was doing at that time either. And so generally, I'm really interested, my sort of like broad artistic and intellectual project is ensuring that we're like complicating history and we're holding the good and the bad together, so that we have a dynamic and nuanced understanding of how the world has come to be, so that we can have an honest conversation about how we build the sort of world that we want to live in. So I'm a third-year graduate student at Harvard University, and I study broadly the history of racial inequality in the United States. And it's very much impossible for me to disentangle my identity from a young social scientist and sociologist from that of my identity as a poet and an artist. And I think both of them are very much informed by the same set of ideas, the same set of texts, and the same broad political project, which is to create and build a better world in which racial inequality is not so perniciously manifesting itself across the entirety of our world. And this work, this poem, I think best represents the sort of like coalescence of my identity as a researcher and my identity as an artist and a writer, because this is what I'm committed to. I'm committed to ensuring that we're having honest conversations about what the world we live in has been like, and how it came to be, and who the people who literally wrote the social contract of this country believed, so that we can have an honest conversation about what the world we occupy actually is, because we understand where it's come from. And only after we understand where we've come from can we understand how we need to move forward. So I grew up in New Orleans. I grew up in a household where stories were told over dinner. And the idea of storytelling was a sort of ubiquitous phenomenon in our home. And I have a grandfather who would tell stories for hours upon hours and days upon days if no one cut him off. And so I grew up always thinking about what it meant to have agency over your own story, and thinking about how important it is and how important it was for me to read stories from other people who looked like me, and how essential that was in me being able to recognize that I had a voice in the literary landscape. Because I think oftentimes we talk about the lack of diversity in publishing, we talk about the lack of diversity in literature. And what spoken word has done is sort of given me an access point. Like the first time I heard a spoken word piece was the first time that I realized that like my voice mattered, and that I could contribute to literature in a way that felt meaningful for me. And it allowed me to come into the literary ecosystem and then sort of like make my way through it in a way that made sense for me. And so I think that at a point I was very disillusioned with people like Yeats and Keats and Anne Sexton. And then what happened with spoken word is that I recognized that there was a lane through which I could enter that world. And then after I gained a deeper appreciation of literature through entering through a space that made the most sense for me, then I was able to go back to people like Keats and Yeats and Sexton and so much of the Western literary canon, and both recognize that there is deep value in it, but also not be afraid to challenge it and say that it needs to be more expansive, it needs to be more holistic, it needs to be more representative of the actual world that we live in. So Mahogany Brown, so summer 2008, I lived in New York City. I had an internship at a publishing company here in the city. And one of the fellow interns said, oh, let's go to the New Eurekan Poetry Cafe tonight. And I was like, the what? I had never heard of it. I was like, no, let's go see the new Tom Cruise movie. That's what I want to do. And she's like, boo, you're whack. We don't want to do that. Come with me. And so I went with her and we went to the New Eurekan Poetry Cafe on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And the New Eurekan is this sort of mecca of spoken word in the literary community. And I had never been, and I had seen some spoken word videos on YouTube and things, but I had never seen it in person. And then when I went, it immediately changed my life in a way that is like not hyperbolic at all. Mahogany Brown was the host of the Friday Night Poetry Slam. Some of the top poets in the city were performing, and I had never been so viscerally moved by art as I had that night. And I had never seen myself represented in literature and in writing in the way that I did that evening. And even beyond seeing myself represented, I think I was pushed to think about the world beyond the context of my own eyes, beyond the context of my own life. And one of the first poems I ever heard was a woman who had cerebral palsy. And in 3 minutes, the way I thought about an entire demographic of people had completely changed. And the idea that I could step into a room thinking about the world one way and leave that same night thinking about the world completely differently was remarkable to me. And I said, this is something I want to be a part of. This is something I want to do. And so I immediately went back to my desk at my lowly internship job. And instead of doing my work, I sat around writing poems all the time. And I went back every Wednesday night until I eventually, if you are coming the top 4 on Wednesday night at the New Eurekan, you make it to the Friday night slam. And on Wednesday night, one Wednesday, maybe 8 weeks in, I cracked that 4th spot. And then I made it to Friday, and I was blown out of the water and lost in a way that is pretty horrific. But I love the thrill of being on stage. I love the thrill of being in communion with other writers. I love the thrill of being in a space that very much affirmed my voice and told me that my story mattered. Because I think so often people of color specifically have their voices suppressed, both in literature and in the world at large. And part of what spoken word does is reject this idea that your voice doesn't matter. It rejects this idea that you don't have something to say, that you can't contribute in your own unique, dynamic, and most authentic way to the world and spark conversation and discourse about the things that you think are important. My name is Clint Smith, and this is my brief but spectacular take on complicating the history of the United States.